right, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida. So a message for our internet audience watching at home. If at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, you can just call the number on your screen. We'll take care of that for you. We'll have the author sign it, and we'll ship it to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. This evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome back Ms. Chantel Acevedo and her new novel, A Falling Star. Ms. Acevedo is currently an associate professor of English and alumni writer in residence at Auburn University, where she founded the Auburn Writers Conference and edits the Southern Humanities Review. Her first novel, Love and Ghost Letters, won the Latino International Book Award and was a finalist for the Connecticut Book of the Year. She is also the author of Song of the Red Cloak, a historical novel for young adults. In this book, we meet Daisy Maria del Pozo and Stella Maris Morales Quinn, who both came to the United States as part of the 1980 Mariel boat lift. Daisy settled in South Florida with her family, and Stella started a new life with her mother and stepfather in Pittsburgh. Over time, they each find themselves haunted by their family's complicated and painful Cuban pasts. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Ms. Chantel Acevedo.
Thank you, everyone. It's really such an honor to be here back at Books and Books. It's been a long time, and it's one of my favorite places on earth. It's just a beautiful bookstore, right? So thank you so much, Victor, and to all the folks who run this wonderful place for hosting me. And thank all of you for coming. This is truly a homecoming. I haven't lived in South Florida since 2000, but I come back many times a year, and it always is sort of a healing return. You know, it feels a little bit like I get a little bit more whole every time I get to come home. So that's very nice. So this book, A Falling Star, first I want to tell you a little bit about how it came to be. It's my third book, but it is a very personal book for lots of different reasons. It's a very Cuban book. It's probably the most Cuban thing I've ever written. And I say that mainly because it's set in Miami, and it's set against the backdrop of both the Mariel boat lift and the rafter crisis of the 1990s, and these really sort of important moments, these watershed moments in Cuban immigration history and Cuban-American relations, for sure. The publisher of the novel is Carolina Wren Press, and they're this wonderful nonprofit press coming out of North Carolina, Durham, North Carolina to be specific. When I got the call that that the book had won the Doris Backwin Prize and that they were going to publish it, my knees sort of buckled, and I was holding my baby who needed a diaper change desperately, and I'm trying to field this call and feeling a little bit faint, and this really wonderful North Carolina voice on the phone saying, "Chantel, this is Robin. We are so thrilled to be able to publish this beautiful book." And Robin Mura has been a delight to work with. And one of the nice things about working with a small press like Carolina Wren Press, who has this wonderful mission of publishing underrepresented writers, which is astounding, especially coming out of North Carolina, coming out of the South, that they have this wonderful mission. They've been around a long time. One of the nice things is that we were able to work together very collaboratively on the look of the book. And in fact, the cover, we sort of worked on it together. We found this amazing Cuban-American photographer named Elaine Palladino. She's working here in South Florida, so if you need portraits taken, Elaine is wonderful. She's Cuban-American. The little girl in the picture, her name is Victoria, and she's a little Cuban-American girl. You know, we got permission from her mommy, so it's all okay, to put her on the cover. And so it's been this sort of really wonderful community effort, you know, which I love and I'm very proud of. So the novel, part of what inspired it is my interest in the many ways in which Cubans have come to South Florida, right? And we all sort of have, you know, if you're Cuban American, your family has a particular story, right? And all these different sort of avenues in, all these different roadways in, and they're all sort of compelling in their way. So the novel really, like I said, the backdrop is the Mariel boat lift and the rafter crisis, which have historically a lot of similarities to them, really sort of intense moments, so 1980 and then the early 90s. But at its heart, really, the novel is about sort of the healing power of love, and family, and how important family is to the Cuban American community. It's our soft spot. You know what I mean? It truly is our soft spot, and it's important to us. And sort of the force of history and the events of history have really hit us in that soft spot. They have divided families. So families are divided, and so that really interests me as well. And so you'll hear me talking a lot about that, about family and particular bonds, mother-daughter bonds and sister bonds, and which sort of compose the fabric of the novel, and sort of my overriding philosophy, my own personal belief that if you are loved well and truly, you can survive anything. And so the characters in this story, and you'll sort of meet them as I read from the novel a little bit, they are, especially the young characters, very, very much loved, and it's sometimes a troubling love and sometimes a smothering love, but they're loved, and so they survive, right? There's great hope in their story. And so I thought I'd read sort of the opening of the novel. The novel is told in, I said this at a reading recently, 3 voices, and then I had a teenager who'd been reading the novel, and she'd gotten to the end, she goes, actually it's 4. And she was right, because the epilogue is a 4th voice that comes in, sort of a surprising voice that comes in. I was like, man, those teenagers, they'll get you every time. Brilliant young woman. And so one of the voices is Daisy del Pozo. And you have to know about Daisy that her name is spelled with a Y, D-A-Y-S-Y, right? And so there's sort of that, I think that particular sort of Cuban naming to a lot of Y, we're Y heavy, like a lot of Y names. A lot of sort of playing with that. And so she is just turning 14, and she lives in Hialeah, which is where I grew up, right? La ciudad que progresa. And she has a mother who smothers her, a smothering mother. Okay, so maybe that's familiar to some of you. My own mother is not like that. My own mother was just very sort of tender and open-minded, and progressive in all kinds of ways. But certainly, lots of moms like this have been part of my life too and have mothered me, in this community. And so she feels very real to me. So we're going to hear a little bit about Daisy, and we're going to hear her family. So her mother is Magdalena, her father is Angel, and she's got a grandfather named Gregorio, right? So if you can picture Hialeah, and also the door that you're going to hear is the door that was on my house when I was growing up in Hialeah. Okay, so it will make sense when you hear it. The front door of Daisy del Pozo's house was a massive thing, gracing a small, modest ranch home, and made of iron bars. Behind the bars was a solid sheet of mustard yellow plastic, dented to look like hammered gold. In the center was a lion on its hind legs, its claws extended and its mouth wide open. Daisy always put her fingers on one of the fangs when she came home from school as she imagined the door coming to life, the iron jaws snapping and swallowing her fingers whole. The door was her mother's prized possession. Like the castles in Spain, Magdalena said, though she had never been there. I don't like it, Mommy, Daisy told her when she first saw the door. Be quiet, Daisy. Don't you see it's just the thing? Magdalena swept her arm to present a neighborhood of squat, pastel-colored homes, each with terracotta tiles on the roof, busted-up cars, bird baths of La Virgen, twisty iron bars on the windows, and menacing iron doors. The kind seen all over Hialeah, the city just north of Miami where the Del Pozos lived, famous for its racetrack that now stood empty and decaying on the east side of town. The flock of flamingos it once showcased still living and breathing, guarding the center island of the track. Hialeah was famous too for its Cuban population, for the street signs in Spanish, and for the flooding that happened after every rainfall when the canals swelled and took over the roads. Our house looks like a prison, Daisy muttered. She had turned 14 at the end of May, and her birthday had marked a change in Daisy that Magdalena had not yet recognized. Daisy hid the signs well. Sometimes a huge sadness would well up in Daisy's chest for no reason, triggered by the whiteness of the sun or by a sappy commercial on television. When she first discovered blood in her underwear the day after her 14th birthday, Daisy hid in the tool shed out in the backyard for hours, breaking up the hard dirt floor with a stick. With some difficulty, she buried the stained clothing deep in the center of the shed. 2 lizards scampered to the scene and marked the turned earth with their tiny feet, prompting Daisy to leave the shed at last and enter the house. She didn't tell her mother and bought herself sanitary pads with her lunch money. There were other things Daisy did not tell Magdalena. For instance, when 2 thin, sweaty men came to install the iron door, one of the saw blades used to trim the iron leapt from the machine and flew into the house. Just as Daisy was walking from the kitchen through the dining room, she felt the swish of a flying thing behind her just at her neck and heard the thud as the circular blade lodged itself in the china cabinet. The saw had wanted blood and it sliced open the leg of one of the men before it took flight. The man bound his leg with his shirt and kept working. Daisy didn't tell either of her parents how close she'd come to death. The moment marked her in a way, as if the blade had nicked her, so that later, if she felt a cool draft on her neck, Daisy sensed a phantom pain there. She thought she'd keep that secret as a treasure in her pocket, a reminder of mortality, of growing up, of something to show for her life. The Del Pozos all stood in front of the house to look at the door, the sunset lighting the yellow plastic insets on fire so that the lion was in a state of perpetual immolation, or at least until the sun finally went down. Magdalena, Angel, and Daisy stood a little to the side to avoid stepping in a dried puddle of the workman's blood. From outside, Daisy could hear her grandfather singing loudly in his bedroom, "Don't cry for me, Argentina," in wavering tones, the few English words he knew. If her grandfather had been in his right mind, Daisy imagined he would have hated the door too. And so I'm going to break there for a minute. And then that's the opening scene, in front of the house. And then I want to give you a scene of dinner at what dinner looks like in her house. As you can see, I'm not like your typical curvy girl, South Florida girl. I'm sort of like that. Bony, like I have been called una vara de tumbar mango. That has happened. And so this has been my life, right? My plight of wishing I was that curvy girl. And so Daisy, I've sort of imagined her that way. And if you've grown up in a Cuban family, a Latin American family, how important it is that our babies be pudgy and that they eat all the food on the plate, right? This is important. And so this was very familiar to me, with apologies to my grandmother in the front row who doesn't understand me right now. So, dinner seemed to follow the same script each evening. Silence was mandatory except for Magdalena's incessant demand. Daisy, come, traga, no hables. To eat, swallow, and not talk. From TV, Daisy knew that families came together for dinner to talk about school, work, and politics. Sometimes they fought at the table or resolved a family issue. There was mashed potato to be passed and grace to be said. In the Del Pozo home, dinner was only for Magdalena and Daisy. Angel would eat early, as soon as he came home from the parking lot where he worked, slurping his steaming, thick, creamy soup in the kitchen, and then complaining about a burnt tongue all evening. Coño, me quemé la lengua, he would repeat, louder and louder until Magdalena would bring him an ice cream sandwich. Abuelo would eat whatever was on hand, bags of chips, bites out of avocados, chunks of Cuban bread, all day long. Magdalena and Daisy ate in silence because dinner time was for eating, not speaking. They could talk later. Magdalena watched Daisy eat, making sure she swallowed every single grain of rice. If Daisy drank too much water, Magdalena would say, "You're getting full on water. Eat, eat," and then push Daisy's glass to the center of the table out of reach. At the end of the meal were the obligatory slice of guava and cream cheese. It's very fattening, so eat up. And then the lecture about how a girl had to be curvy to get a boyfriend someday. One night, between gulps of water, Daisy had said, "Mommy, do you think I'm smart enough to go somewhere like Yale someday? Someplace like that?" And here I have to do the accent, because the mother's response is, "Jail? Jail? What are you talking about? Eat." And that will be the end of my accent. Oh, well, it'll come in one more time. Daisy laughed. No, Yale, the university. She had seen a movie set in New Haven on Yale's green, elm-filled campus and imagined an older version of herself there, wearing lab goggles like the character in the film and holding test tubes up to fluorescent lights. "Ah, sí, la universidad," Magdalena said. "And where is this Yale?" "Connecticut, mami." "Connecticut? No way, mijita." I'll drop it now. Nice girls don't go away for college. That's only for Americans. Magdalena dropped her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "They don't love their children and want to be rid of them. That's the truth." I sense that some of you have heard this line before. Besides, there are plenty of good schools here. "What if I want to become a scientist?" Daisy asked, testing her mother. The truth was that she'd given it some thought. In the comic books she'd read, the scientists were always elevated above mere mortals. They had the power to turn even the mousiest human into a god. Just one radioactive zap would do the trick, Daisy thought. "You can't even wash yourself properly, and you want to go away?" Magdalena said. "Who will make your bed? Who will cook your meals? I'll be grown by then. Don't be so ambitious. It's not good for you." Magdalena said this, shimmying Daisy's plate so that the beans Daisy had so carefully compressed into a tight heap flattened out, filling the plate again. "You haven't eaten a thing," Magdalena said, sighing. During those meals, Daisy wished that Florida wasn't flat and that it wasn't so long, so hard to get out of. She swore to herself that it was easier to leave Cuba than to leave this place. She wished her mother would let her go to sleepover parties, or to summer camp out of state. No, she had to be within Magdalena's reach at all times, in her vice-like embrace. Sometimes Daisy imagined her mother transforming into a giant rusty anchor that held the family in place. This anchor, her mother, was lodged at the bottom of a murky Hialeah canal, and it would never let Daisy go. "Don't be so arrepentida," her mother said, when Daisy brought up Yale at dinner again the next night. "What does that mean?" Daisy asked, and rolled her eyes so far back in her head her left eyelid twitched. "It means you're ashamed of who you are, that you regret you were born into this family, that you..." "I'm not." "No que va," Magdalena said. "Not a thing. But let me tell you something, muchachita. You leave Miami, and there will be lots to regret." Magdalena cleared Daisy's dishes, though she hadn't finished her food. Daisy thought she was done getting told off, but her mother whipped around, pointed a dish at Daisy, and declared, "You don't know what alone means. Alone. Sola. Your father and I had nobody in este país, nadie, y ahora you want to throw away your family? Arrepentida is what you are." So that's the opening scene with Daisy and her mother.
Very strong.
Yeah, mama. So that's one kind of love, but Daisy is loved. She's loved, right? All of that, shackling her down and holding her down, that's coming from this very deep and abiding love that her mother has for her, which I always remind myself when I was teaching high school. Sometimes the parents would come in like lions, they'd be mad about something with their child, and I would always remind myself, this is love, right? And it was hard because I'd get mad. But I remember this is a parent who so loves this child that they've sort of, maybe they're not seeing the forest for the trees right now, but this is love. And if I reminded myself of that adoration, we could work it out, So I wanted to share with you another kind of love in the story. There's another young voice in the novel. Her name is Stella, and she is another little girl with a Mariel connection, and she lives with her mother in Pittsburgh, right, where I lived for a little bit. So she sort of lived outside of the Cuban-American community. Her experience is quite different than Daisy's, okay? And her mother is very troubled, is a very troubled person as well. So keep that in mind. Her mother's name is Anita, okay? Stella's bedroom had golden stars painted on the walls and the ceiling. At night, they caught the light from the street outside and shimmered. Her mother had called her mi estrellita, my little star. On clear nights, the two of them would climb the steel fire ladder on the side of the house and lie on the roof, pointing out the constellations, making wishes. Deseos, her mother called them. "I wish Daddy won't go bald," Stella would say. "I wish the wrinkle above my nose would go away," Anita would add. "I wish you'll always love me." That one's already true. "I wish you'll stay with me for siempre." Always. This was Stella's final wish before the hard shingles on the roof pressing against her spine would be too much and would drive them both back down the fire ladder. After Anita died, Stella would drag her father onto the roof, and they would not play the wishing game. She would press her head against his chest and say, "I love you, Daddy, forever and ever and ever," extending the evers until she was out of breath, and Michael was laughing so hard his chest rumbled with joy. One night, when the faint ghost of the Milky Way was visible overhead, Stella thought to ask her mother about her family. "Tell me about my father." And here she means her real father, right? Because Michael is a stepfather. "No sé," Anita said. "You always say that. How about my grandmother? Was she nice?" "My family never loved me," Anita said without hesitation, but also without anger. She said it the way one might mention that it is raining or that the mail didn't come today. "Still," Stella pursued, "I'd like to know about them, the other Moraleses, I mean. Just because they share your name, it doesn't mean they were people worth knowing." Again, her mother's bland tone struck Stella, scared her into thinking that here was a person who could not be moved, who would think nothing of stepping off the roof of the house, and on the way down, would feel no fear, no joy. "I think it's important," Stella said in a whisper. "You were nameless when you came to me. We all are at first. But I could have named you Luisa or Enriqueta." Stella wrinkled her nose, and her mother wrapped her arms around her. "Or caquita frita," her mother said with a laugh, and Stella, imagining being named fried shit for a lifetime, couldn't help but laugh too, up there on the roof with the Milky Way hiding behind a cloud. So it's a different kind of love that you see with Stella and her mother, right, who was very troubled, and we sort of, this is all in flashback, we meet Stella when her mother has already died. So you can see, for me, sort of that interest of those bonds and how they can sort of heal other tragedies that have happened in a life. And so both of these little girls have the Mariel boat lift in their past, and they have they're currently living through this rafter crisis. So I thought the last little bit I would read would be a historical moment, just to get a sense of that, like an action moment, right? So, I mean, I'm sure most of you know, are pretty sort of with it on the details of the Mario boat lift, but of course it's 1980. About 124,000 Cubans came to South Florida after a couple of Cubans stormed the Peruvian embassy seeking asylum. The Peruvians said, sure, you can stay, and then 10,000 more Cubans showed up, right? And it became this tremendous crisis. Fidel Castro made a big speech that said, you can go, we don't want you, you're gusanos, you're worms, get out. Jimmy Carter on this side of the Gulf said, sure, you can come, right? And so we have the gates opening up. And so after the moment at the embassy, people were sent home. They eventually cleared the embassy. And people waited to leave, right? They waited for their turn to the port of Mariel to go. And meanwhile, people in Miami were renting boats and taking out loans to rent shrimp boats and whatever dinghy they could get to go get abuela and abuelo and family, right? They were desperate to come and pick them up, right? And so here we have Daisy's family. When Daisy is just 5 years old, she's little, and her parents are waiting to get picked up, and they get picked up by a soldier on driving a bus who's going to take them to the port. Okay, there's another character who comes in, and it's sort of part of the mystery of the novel, and it's something Daisy, I'm not spoiling it, Daisy discovers within the first 30 pages or so of the book that she had a sister who was lost in the crossing, right? That there was a baby sister, an infant, who was lost. Okay, so when you hear the name Belen, that's her sister's name. All right. The other names that will be new here, we already know Magdalena, and we know her husband Angel, and the girls are Daisy and Belen. And then the other one here is Eddie, and this is Magdalena's brother, and Catalina, who's Eddie's wife. Okay, and this is who they've been staying with. They'd come in the middle of the night 2 weeks later, banging on Eddie's front door, waking the adults in the house. Magdalena knew now was the moment of departure. They wouldn't have a chance to gather many things, to say a long goodbye. Outside, a windowless bus waited, full of refugees. Ya voy, she heard Eddie say loudly as he ran to the door. If she knew her brother, he'd be stuffing the soldiers' pockets with money to protect her. Magdalena and Angel gathered the girls. Daisy had been sleeping with her cousin, who later shows up in the novel in a raft, right? That's where that storyline comes in. Her young cousin is one of the Balseritos. She'd been sleeping in bed with her cousin Amado, and their small arms were thrown over each other's faces. Magdalena did not want to wake Amado, though she longed to see his brown eyes for the last time. She kissed his forehead, felt his small breaths on her cheek for a moment, and lifted Daisy from his side. Angel cradled Belen in one arm and held their travel bag in the other. The soldier stood in the living room, holding a cup of coffee that Catalina had made him. He drank down the last of the cup and handed it back to Catalina, who still held a small tray in her hands. Hurry up, the soldier bellowed and glanced at the bus outside. I said hurry, he yelled again, as Magdalena and Angel appeared in the living room. Hermano, Magdalena said weakly and held open her arms to Eddie. Courage, he whispered in her ear, and Magdalena held him more tightly with her free arm. Daisy crushed between them. Magdalena and Angel took turns hugging Catalina. Angel and Eddie shook hands, and Catalina kissed Belen's forehead, then Daisy's, so a prolonged goodbye. Are you certain you won't come to the U.S. someday? Magdalena asked, holding Catalina's hands. The women had made peace in the last days, moving past political alliances and finding some common ground as they watched Daisy and Amado playing together. A few times Catalina would point at the children as they ran about, saying, they will be strangers to one another if you go. And tears would always spring to Magdalena's eyes. A deep crease formed in the center of Catalina's forehead. Magdalena gave her one last kiss before leaving the house. The night was muggy and the air thick. Magdalena and Angel boarded the bus and found there were no seats together for them. Each family group had taken up its own row, leaving an empty space here and there. Angel sat with Belen in an open seat near the back, and Magdalena and Daisy sat near the soldier who had come to get them. She watched, surprised, as he settled into the driver's seat. She looked around for more soldiers. They'd sent only the young man, and Magdalena watched as his hands trembled on the ignition key. With the windows gone, Magdalena could make out Eddie's house for a long time as the bus swerved down the street, starting its long drive east from Havana to the bay at Mariel. The roof above Magdalena's head had a sticky brown glaze on it and smelled distinctly of sulfur. At her feet, crushed eggshells made strange floral patterns. The bus was purposely windowless in order to assure that the passengers inside were easy targets for protesters who knew the bus carried Gusano deserters. Magdalena thanked La Virgen that it was night and the streets were empty. Nevertheless, she wrapped Daisy's head in her arms and turned to see that Angel held Belen in a similar way, his back to the window opening. She kept thinking of bullets, rocks, glass bottles, hard objects that could do real damage when sent flying. She ducked her head and tightened her arms around her daughter. The drive was long, but no one on the bus chanced sleep. Instead, they kept their eyes prized on the bus driver, whose head nodded now and again as he fought sleep himself. Once the bus lurched to the right as the driver awoke suddenly, and one of the passengers had the temerity to yell, "Oye, wake up! You'll kill us all!" Magdalena turned to glare at the yelling man, wishing he hadn't thought to give the driver any ideas. But the young man at the wheel pretended not to hear. Magdalena watched as the tips of his ears reddened. As the tips of his ears reddened, how his knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. He didn't fall asleep again. The wind had turned cold by the time they reached the town of Mariel. The driver sped through town, and Magdalena strained her eyes as she watched the low houses rush by, hoping to keep them in her memory somehow. She hadn't seen much of Cuba, just the countryside in Pinar del Rio where she grew up, in the shadows of the sierras, with their limestone walls in the distance, the streets of Havana and her brother's small fishing town. She had never seen Columbus's cross in Baracoa, or walked the cobble streets of Santiago, or visited the Isle of Youth to see the giant sea turtles lay their eggs in the sand. Magdalena knew she was leaving an unexplored Cuba behind, and felt a little like the pirates of the past, who had plundered and used the land, but hadn't stopped to love it. Daisy struggled to shake off her blanket, but Magdalena held the cloth tightly, irritated by the child's fussing. "Mama," Daisy whined, "where's Papi? Where's Belen?" "Shh," Magdalena said through her teeth, feeling herself wound too tightly, wishing to take it out on someone, no matter how small. Her neck ached from holding Daisy, and every time she heard Belen's cries in the back of the bus, Magdalena stiffened more, afraid to stand and stretch without permission from the driver. She fought the urge to shush the crying that filled the bus. "Mama," Daisy whined again and placed a small, cold hand on Magdalena's cheek. Just then, with a screech of brakes, the bus stopped. Magdalena and Daisy crashed into the seat in front of them, Daisy's mouth closing on the sticky surface, her lip torn open. Beneath her feet, Magdalena felt the wild thumping of whatever it was the driver had hit. The thumping seemed to move down the aisle between the seats and emerged at the back of the bus in the shape of a tall goose, faltering on its feet, its long neck bent at an odd angle. The sound of the goose against the bus resounded in Magdalena's chest with a light knocking, and she would feel that knock for days afterward, faintly. There were cries of "Ay!" and "Mi madre!" as the passengers stood to watch the goose stagger to the side of the road and sit, then glance up at the sky and stay that way as if in supplication. Daisy's cries were muffled by the sudden chatter, which followed the release of tension. Angel took the opportunity to push his way to the front of the bus. He passed Belen to Magdalena and gathered Daisy in his arms, and she quieted at once when it became clear that her lip was not badly injured. Magdalena marveled at the way Angel calmed Daisy as she adjusted Belen in her arms. Yes, she thought, Daisy is her father's, and Belen all mine. People had rearranged themselves in the commotion, and the seat had become available in front of Magdalena. Together they watched as the soldier tried to regain control of the passengers. He was smaller than most of the men on board. His uniform was loose on him, the seat of his pants baggy and wrinkled. His hands, Magdalena noticed, were shaking as he pointed to the seats, and he too seemed distracted by the goose, dying now, it was clear, on the side of the road. "Stay inside," he growled at last, and stepped through the door of the bus. They watched in silence as the young soldier approached the goose. "What's he going to do?" a woman asked. "Put it out of its misery," said another. "Eat it," someone else offered, attempting humor. No one laughed. "Not him," Angel said. "He's harmless." They watched as the driver neared the goose. Almost there, Magdalena thought, cheering him on in her head. She realized suddenly that she'd grown fond of the thin, nervous boy. But just as he reached the goose, the animal fell over, still, its feathers rustling in the cool wind. They watched as the soldier covered his hands, his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. It was Angel who was the first to move. He left Daisy on the seat and made his way out of the bus toward the soldier. He put a hand on the young man's shoulder, and the passengers heard Angel say, "Hombre," loudly, and then, "Come on, you've got a job to do." Magdalena trembled with anger. How could he? Angel exhausted her. His kindnesses left her feeling small and afraid. When he re-entered the bus, Magdalena did not meet her husband's eyes. It was only when the bus rattled past a tall chain-link fence and the horizon became a field of masts, bobbing up and down, that Magdalena saw Angel again in the seat before her, taking hold of his hand over his left shoulder. So it's just a small moment. And the reason I wanted to share that is because even it would have been very easy for me to paint the soldier as a villain, as one of the bad guys. But he's young and afraid too. And so I wanted to show sort of compassion on both sides of that aisle, And so Angel does this sort of huge thing, right? Like telling him it's okay. It's okay and you can finish this job. So again, sort of love crops up in the novel, sort of in many forms. I wanted to say one more thing before opening it to questions, because I'm done reading at this point. So I've said that this novel really comes from an interest of mine regarding immigration and exile and how Cubans have come to this country. But the truth is that the inspiration for this novel actually has a very real source. And so I promised I would totally embarrass her. So that's my friend Arlenis right there. She's waving. And her dad is here too. I don't know where he went. He's hiding. And that's Erensto. And so I met Arlenis when we were in the 9th grade, and I was Daisy's age, 14 years old, and we were complete idiots. And one day, we were about 15, we were waiting in front of the house of another friend, and that's this one right here. And so we were waiting for her to come out because she's always late. And I forget what it was that we were talking. We were talking about like how about our past and our heritage. And Arlenis started telling me a little bit about her story. And her story is a Mariel story too, right? She came to this country when she was 5 years old. And so she tells me this really magnificent story. And I'm going to sort of paraphrase it, and maybe you can ask her later for details. But the story is that she and her parents came on the boats, and when they got to where they were getting, they sort of crowd surfed the children off the boat, right? Or got the children off the boat somehow. And there were so many people, it was such confusion that Arlenis got lost. 5 years old, lost, right? And I remember her telling me the story, and I'm thinking, even then, how terrifying that must have been for her parents, to lose her among thousands, to lose her where there was very deep water, right? These are docks we're talking about. And she was found much later, right? That same day, but later, after sort of a panic, in the arms of a very elderly blind man. Am I getting this right? Sort of. Okay, well, this is what I remember. And who she had stumbled into, and this very old blind man had taken her into his arms and just sat with her and protected her until her family could be found, right? Just what a cool story, right? When I started thinking about this novel, this little memory from a long time ago when we were just in the 9th grade sort of percolated and bubbled up to the surface. And I remember the first question I asked myself was, oh my God, what if they hadn't found her, right? What if after all of that sacrifice and all of that struggle to come here, they would have lost their most precious thing, right? Their one little girl. And so that was really the beginning of the novel. So Daisy is not Arlenis, and Arlenis is not Daisy, but very, very much her story and her family story were the inspiration for this, And so one, I'm eternally thankful for your friendship, right? Forget the novel, just for your friendship. So thank you for that. But also I think it's a wonder how stories sort of are told and where the inspiration for them comes, And so those of you who are now 15, 14 in the audience, maybe your best friend told you a story recently that will one day become a book. And that's a really cool thing to think about. So listen to your friends, right? They've got cool things to say. And listen to each other. And so anyway, so thank you very much for coming. And so if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But now it's your turn. So thank you. So what are your questions? Yeah. How did I get inspired? Well, Arlenis' story inspired me, right? So that was the first thing. Yeah. There's a question back there.
Yes, what do you think how do you attribute the success of many of the boat people that came over here in 1980? There were articles about how well they succeeded versus the others that came earlier. How would you?
I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's particularly interesting because at the time people weren't feeling that, right?
They were feeling the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Like the first wave that came, they were the educated ones. They were the ones that were leaving and bringing in their knowledge and their.
Yeah, and at the time, Mariel was a scary thing. And I would even venture to say that when my friend told me that story in the 90s, even then it was an admission, right? That even in the 90s, it wasn't necessarily the coolest thing in the world to be saying that you were a Marielita, right? Like there was a kind of sort of shame because, and the reason there was this sort of strange feeling was because Fidel Castro emptied out the prisons and the psychiatric wards. And he said, you cannot take Abuela until you take these 10 prisoners too, right? And so there was an influx of sort of dangerous folks who came as well. Of course, not the majority were good people, but there was enough of that fear. I think the Cubans who came in Maria just very quickly assimilated to this area. And I think the Cubans who were already here, I think ultimately were very helpful. You know, I think there was a big sort of like open arm welcome, and now we're going to sort of help each other do this, which is sort of lovely about this community in general. You know, there's a community built on immigrants, not just Cubans, of all kinds, you know, and there is this, I feel here in Miami, there's just sort of respect for that journey. There's a respect for the struggle, you know. Immigrants are seen as people and not other, you know, but as human as well, and that we all sort of share this story. So I think the success of the people who came in the Mario boat lift and everyone who comes here, I think it's no surprise. I think this is fertile ground, you know, and that's not the case for immigrants who land in other places where the ground is barren and it's unwelcoming, you know. So I think it's Miami, right? And it's the citizens of Miami who made it work. Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
When you write a book like this, and there's so much residual legacy, political, cultural bricks that you're carrying on your shoulders, like how do you decide what your objective is going to be? Because I'm just a storyteller, that's what I'm doing, but you have all of this other stuff going. How do you reconcile that? Do you decide to address those issues, or do you decide for those chips to fall where they may?
I feel like that's a really good question too, and I think if you're writing about Cuba in the 80s, Cuba and Miami in the 80s and 90s, you can't pretend that those political differences don't exist. You can't be like, la la la, it's all about, you know, I'm just going to be art and here's a pretty sentence, because then it's not realistic fiction, right? It's not a real life. And so I don't go into it thinking of an agenda. I think that's a mistake. You know, that's like backing up into a story. Rather, I think of it as, here's a family that feels very real to me in my imagination, and I want them to be real on the page too. So that's in all of their humanity and all of their flaws, you know, and addressing all of those things, you know. And so you have characters in this novel on both sides of the political spectrum, you know, and on both sides behaving poorly with each other, those kinds of things, you know. Ultimately, it's the story of one particular family very strongly, so their views sort of come up to the surface a little bit more just because the focus is on them. But I try to show them struggling with it. You know, I mean, that it isn't just about, I believe this, but that those beliefs have repercussions, and they're not always easy repercussions, you know. And I think part of it for me was in having teenagers be two of the voices are very adult voices, but having some younger voices too, I think they sort of even things out a bit, you know, because they are not sort of burdened with politics as much. They're just sort of taking it as it is. And so you get maybe a purer reaction to those kinds of discussions that happen in the home, you know, and having them filter through Daisy, I think was helpful as well. But yeah, I don't think about agendas. I think more about theme, you know what I mean, and sort of the heart of the story, and not so much agenda-driven. Yeah. Thank you.
Penny wanted me to ask you why you became an author.
Why I became an author? That's a good question. Well, I couldn't not become an author. You know, I wrote even when I was a little girl. You know, I was always writing. I'm happiest when I'm writing. There are periods of time when I don't do any writing, and eventually it starts to nag at me. I start to feel this over-writing guilt, and it's not because anyone's waiting for a book in particular or an editor or anything like that. It's really coming from like in here, like it's a guilt towards myself, you know, like I have this thing I love to do and I'm okay at it, and to not do it seems like a shame. Yeah, so yeah.
I just want to thank you for taking your heritage that is so strong, taking it all the way to Auburn, where you have made a big impact in some people that I know.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it. I love being one of like 3 Cubans in Auburn. It's great. There's maybe 5 of us. 6 if I include my own kids, you know. No, it's been wonderful. It's been wonderful there, and people have been you think Alabama's the Deep South? People have been very open to learning about sort of a different culture, and it's been a lovely experience there too. Thank you.
Well, I know that one of your friends in Auburn tried to make a hippie out of you, but she didn't succeed.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. All right, other questions? One more? Yeah. Oh, one more over here? No? That was like a maybe. It's over there. Okay. Hi.
When you're writing a work of art and fiction that has a historical element, what is the role of research in that process?
Yes, that's a good question. It's a very big role. You know, it has to be, otherwise you're playing games then, right? You're just making it up. And I wanted it to sort of have an authentic sensibility. It had to be authentic, you know. And so one of the first books I read was Mirta Ojito's Finding Mañana, beautiful nonfiction book about her experience in Mariel. That was a really important work. And then beyond that, I get a lot of inspiration from photographs. You know, so I looked at a lot of pictures, a lot of archival stuff. I was surprised to not find a lot of photographs about Mariel besides like giant like boat shots, and not a lot of individual people waiting around and being processed. I couldn't find many of those. And so that was frustrating for me, and I actually had a character try to do research and get very frustrated because she couldn't find pictures, you know? Like I was looking for, like, I want that one shot of a little soulful little kid sitting, I couldn't find it. Like, I don't know what the photographers in Miami were doing, but they weren't down there, you know? Like, or they've, like, archived their pictures and no one can find them. But it really is an important role, yeah.
How has the reaction of the Cuban community affected you?
How has the reaction of the Cuban community affected me? Well, it's the Cuban community has, at least from the very beginning when Love and Ghost Letters came out, at least the community here in Miami, you know, was just so welcoming and really wonderful, you know. There hasn't been one single reaction, though. It's not like a monolith, you know, like there isn't like one, you know, sort of attitude in the Cuban community. So there have been sort of multiple attitudes. But in general, I think pride, you know, which is nice. It's nice to hear someone go, oh, eres un orgullo, right? Like that means a lot to us that one of our own has published. You know, there's this other great writer, her name is Janine Capo-Cruzet, who wrote this collection of short stories called How to Leave Hialeah. When I saw that, I was floored. I immediately called her. I was like, you, I love you. Who are you? You know? And so I think there's some of that, like that affinity that we look for in each other, you know, and one of the very first novels, and I'll end with this story, okay? Unless there are any other burning questions, then I'll end with this story. It's about another writer, right? Because I like talking about other writers because I'm a reader, you know? One of the books that changed my life was Cristina Garcia's Dreaming in Cuban. Like, changed the course of my life. And if you've not read that book, you should, but it came out in the 90s. And I was like an undergrad, and I was writing fiction and creative writing classes at the University of Miami. Woo, okay. But I was writing about my wonderful stepdad's family, like my dad's family, and they're from upstate New York. And so I was writing about these people. I was writing about pine trees, though I'd never seen them, you know, and these kind of things, because my educational experience had been one in which I'd only read a lot of white dudes, you know, like that's what I'd read a lot of. And no, I hadn't at that point, beyond Jose Marti, I had not read any Latino authors, you know. And so I just didn't see it as a possibility. That's not what real writers write about. You know, real writers write about rivers and pine trees, right? And so I was writing these stories and getting A's and B's and doing all right. And then one day I walked into Westland Mall in Hialeah. And that was back in the golden days when there used to be bookstores in malls, and it was a Dalton bookstore. And I walk in there, and there's this beautiful Dreaming in Cuban just sitting there on a shelf. You know, if you've seen it, it's a gorgeous book with a girl and a hibiscus, right? And I go, what? I just stumble towards it like this, and I pick it up. I'm like, what is this? Dreaming in Cuban in Hialeah, you know? I start doing this, and there's words in Spanish, and there are characters immediately who I recognize as people that I could have grown up with, you know? And it was in that moment, discovering that book, was like every window in my imagination exploded. And I'd found my subject, because here was someone saying, you have permission to tell this story, right? Like, this is literature too. And I didn't get it until then, you know? So back to that question, you know, like, how has the community embraced me? I don't know if there's like one sort of massive embrace, but I know how I embrace authors who represent the reality of my childhood and my growing up here, and that's with incredible love and gratitude, you know, and I owe them the world for laying down that pavement, you know. So it's been wonderful, I guess. And tonight has been wonderful. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Okay, folks, so if there are no more questions, reminder for our internet audience watching at home, there's still plenty of time to call the number on your screen. You could purchase a copy of tonight's book. We will have Chantel sign it for you. We'll ship it to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. Also, a reminder that all of our live stream events are archived. So if you don't get to watch them live, you can go to the Books and Books website, go to the live streaming link, and any appearance that's been broadcast from here in the store will be saved there for you to watch at your convenience. For those of you here in the house, we have a falling star, as well as one of her previous novels, Love and Ghost Letters. They're going to be for sale at the counter over there. Chantel is going to be signing at the table to my left. And one more request, since we have such a big turnout in the room here tonight. If when you got up, you folded your chair and stacked it against the wall, it would be a big, big help in getting this room emptied out efficiently and safely. So books are for sale over there. She's signing at the table to my left. And please give Chantel another hand. Thanks very much.